thank you. So we're going to keep going into hydrodynamics and models, but I think I'm going to even step back a bit. So I would like to talk to you about all the different hydrodynamic scale of the marine dispersal, and also emphasize the strengths of those models, but the weaknesses and the limitation that we really need to keep in mind. And I'm going to use the example of those 3 projects listed at the bottom, so some from eReef and a couple from the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. Here we go. So I guess we already heard about that a fair bit during this session, but marine dispersal is very important to support coral restoration, and that's because we've got those marine species that their reproduction rely on this dispersal of coral larvae. And on this figure is just a photo from Ames showing some coral spawning slick that are at the surface of the ocean, and their displacement is really due to the ocean circulation. And then those coral larvae are going to be dispersed and move around and maybe reach other reefs. And downstream, we often use that for those reef connection, and we try to identify which reef is going to be, a receiving reef, and some others that's going to be the source for others. And that's where the decision I made downstream. And sometimes those connections can be big, up to hundreds of kilometers. And here that's just an example showing how the Palm Island is connected to other reef in the central GBR. But like I said, I'd like to step back a bit and talk about the marine dispersal and how we give you the best estimate possible of that. And there are those 4 steps I like to talk about. And the first one, again, is this hydrodynamical model that Sev talked about, and then Rob presented as well. Then we go into the Lagrangian tracking and the biophysical properties of those tracks, and then we go to the connectivity. In all of those steps, there are strengths and weaknesses along the way. But today I'd like to go back to this first step, those hydrodynamical models. What can they do? What are the limitations? Because this is very important to not forget when you go all the way to decision making in the end. So in my mind, there's 2 different big scales in the Great Barrier Reef. The first one is the GBR-wide. We want to look at the whole World Heritage Area. We want to understand the inter-reef connection through those 2,000 kilometers. At that scale, we actually know a fair bit of what the circulation looks like. We've got the South Equatorial Current coming in, we've got the shelf break current, we've got area of upwelling, we've got a lot of tidal circulation inside the lagoon, and some wind-induced current. So we sort of know the physical processes that are happening. But there's another scale that is very important for restoration, and that's the scale of the reef. And in there, there's sort of 2 subscales. There's the fact that we want to understand the connection between the reef, and that's sort of the bottom right schematic there that look at the connection between reef. But we also want to understand what's happening within a reef. So the self-retention and the connection within a reef. Is there area where there's high supply of larvae and others where there's low supply of larvae? So there's and those ones like are hundreds of meters to kilometers. So there's this, big variety of scale that we want to resolve. And for this very fine scale, that's sort of the band at the top of the schematic there, we can see those little recirculation at the back of the reef, those little vertices and eddies. That's the one we want to reproduce with our model if we want to be able to model and reproduce self-retention. So I'm going to give you an example of those different scales across the different projects I've been involved in and the different model we use to try to represent those scales. So the first one is the eReef model. And that's when you want to understand the connection and the connectivity throughout the whole Great Barrier Reef. And through eReef, we've got 2 types of models, the 4-kilometer one and the 1-kilometer one. And that's an example on the right of the circulation we get with the 4K model. With that resolution, we can see the shelf break current, we can see the upwelling area, so the color is the temperature, and we can see the tidal movement. And some people in the community, some people are using the 1K or the 4K to do downstream product. It's important to remember what are the strengths and limitations of those models. So both of them, they're very good at representing this large-scale circulation. So there's going to be good advection and potentially inter-reef connection. But at the scale of the reef, with a 4K resolution, or even a 1K, you cannot reproduce the local retention or the within-reef connection. It's not possible. It's just the size of the model cannot do that. You won't be able to represent the flow between the channel in a reef, unless your channel is 8 kilometers wide, right? It's just not possible. So we need to think about that when you use those product downstream. Then I'm going to go into some example of those very fine scale resolution physical processes we really want to reproduce when we talk about those high resolution model. And then again here to remember, the key is the bathymetry. It's not that the model is missing something. It's just represent whatever it can represent with what we got at 4 kilometers. It's not a lot of reef. So let's go to the high resolution model. And the first example here is the cap bunker that Rob just presented before. And we've got, it's going to move? It is. So we've got temperature in the middle and salinity on the right. At those scale, you can see what the circulation is doing. So we can see sometimes the effect of the wind when there's a very strong blowing, but we also can see the tide turning around. Now, if you start to look in between the reef, you can see how the tidal current is channeled very strongly in between those reefs. What you can see as well on those plots, and you can see inside some of the lagoon reef, the semi-enclosed lagoon, the temperature and the salinity show a different value than outside of the lagoon. It means that the model can represent this semi-enclosed lagoon behavior quite well. We can see as well at the wake of those reefs, sometimes there's some little vertices that start to appear. That's the fine scale little eddies that you really want to represent at that scale. And that's just a quick validation. So we had an ADCP south of Heron Island or Heron Reef, and that's how well the model represents the circulation over there. So we've got the tidal movement, that's the back and forward, but we also have a kind of modulation of that signal, and that's sort of the large-scale circulation that is happening over there. So the model was doing quite a good job at representing that large-scale circulation. Then there's the Palm Island model that Rob also introduced. Here we're also looking at, fine-scale channel, and this animation, what is I want you to look at is this current that are pushed through in between the island. They are pushed back and forward by the tide, and what's happening, you can see a lot of little vertices spinning off. And on the left here is just a still image of those vertices, so that's in between the top of the main island, so the channel on top of Palm Island. And you can see the scale of those vertices. They grow and they go to 2 to 3 kilometers. And that's the one that's going to converge your particle, going to converge your larvae, and impact the local supply in this area. So that's what the model can represent here. Now the last model is the Lizard Island model that you might heard about in the next talk coming up. There we went very, very high resolution, 50 meters. Is it going to move? It's moving too. Great. For this one, again, you can see on the animation that's temperature and current. We can see the tide going around, but there's a bit stronger influence of the large-scale circulation at the size of the island. Now you can look inside the lagoon in the south, and you can see how the tide coming in and out of this lagoon, but also there's some period of very calm current when the current is very still. So that those slack conditions that when you do those moving coral and restoration program, you are looking for those very calm conditions, and so people in the field can deliver their competent larvae. And that sort of those calm conditions is what we are trying this model to reproduce as well as possible. On the right is sort of a zoom in the south in between the two islands, just to show how resolution the channel are, but also to give you a comparison of how good the model is doing. So on the right, you've got the current direction. So again, it's quite bipolar. It's because of the tide coming in and out. And you've got the variability, the time series of the current more on the left or middle, and you see how well the model fits at those spots anyway. Just to zoom in again in that channel is to show you how dynamic that is. And that's at 2 meter deep here. Because it's very shallow, at 2 meter deep, you've got just a channel in there. And you can see how the flow is rushing in and out. And there's some very strong acceleration and a lot of change. And that's a very viable environment. And so that's the challenge here. That's what we're trying to model and that we're hoping represents the reality. So in sort of conclusion for those small scale, there's all those things those models can do really well. So they can sort of do really well inter-reef connection. They can represent those fine scale processes, those convergence zone and a bit of retention. And they can sort of represent within reef pattern. And that's sort of summarized there in one of the figures from Robert around Heron Island. Those are the modeling result here. And you can see those pattern of connectivity around the main reef. They actually reproduced from one year to another. And their sort of high connectivity area are the same across all those spawning events. And that's what the hydrodynamic is doing. But those patterns, they're not at the scale of 100 meters. There's more at the scale of 1 kilometer. And that's sort of what the model can do. It sort of represents those patterns at 1 kilometer, not at 10 meters or 50 meters. That's too big of an ask for the model. Now we need to think about the limitation as well, and there's quite a lot, and we shouldn't shy away from that. And there's a few examples from the analysis that Marin did in Lizard Island. And some of them, that small bay, in the north of the island, there's a small bay called Mermaid Bay, and the model didn't work really well over there. The bay was too small, not enough grid point in there. It didn't work. And the bottom of the model is the same everywhere, when in reality you go out in a reef, there's some sand, there's some rock, there's some reef, so the friction at the bottom can be different. And here there's an example where our tidal model is completely out of phase. And it's just because the tide was not slowed down in the model world. Now just to conclude, we've got those two scales that we're using, and that's the best estimate from, I guess, modelers trying to give our product out there. They're the GBR-wide scale and they're the very high resolution scale. There's limitation in both worlds, but at the moment, those both worlds are split. And ideally, we would like those two scales to converge in the future, so we have one product that can resolve all those scales, the large one and the small one. And that's sort of where I'm getting at just with that last slide, and that we're sort of trying to work toward that in the modeling world, in the hydrodynamic model world, where we'll have unstructured model in 3D covering the whole GBR, and we have very fine scale resolution across the reef matrix and lower in the coral sea. And that's what it could look like in a few years when we're able to run those models on long time scale very efficiently. But that gives, a beautiful picture of the reef with a shell break current, the upwelling at very fine scale, and all the little channel and current going there. Thank you.